my first question, and we can go around, like, don't really have a set format for this, but there was a question that was asked from the audience about, I think it was around the idea of delegation. I think it was fielded to you, right? And one of the questions that I feel like I've been answering for 15 years at this point is, why is this so hard? Like, why do we need all these systems upon systems, and why is it delegation? Why isn't it just empower people and kind of let them figure it out? Talk to me a little bit about it. What's driving some of this need for such hyper-explicit change?
So I think there's a couple of interesting avenues on that. An important first one is, I think we have different responsibilities in the organization. Like, I don't think every product owner on a delivery team gets to set the strategic direction for the company. So he's got to be operating within some constraints. I think the challenge is that we don't know how to set those constraints in a way that puts the proper decision-making closest to the metal. So the concept of delegation, it's delegating responsibility, it's delegating decision-making, but with the right sort of context around it, so we kind of know where we're going. There's also, I think it's really important that we've got the feedback on the backside to make sure that we understand whether we delegated it correctly or not. But I think the challenge is, just trust the team to go do whatever they want to do and build something. Like, I don't think it's pragmatic. I think we have to help them set a direction. And when we don't have ways of doing that effectively, then we start dictating. I think there's a difference between dictating and delegating.
Okay. Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that I'm not sure the name, the gentleman that asked the question, he said something like, I want to be able to share strategy and vision into the organization. Something like that. I think that's exactly right. That's actually the start of, the way I think about it, that's the start of delegating. It's setting clarity around where are we trying to go and why is that important. Check me here, Chris, if I'm wrong, but I think Ford made a quick pivot last year for a time and started producing something completely not related to cars in response to the pandemic. Started producing some masks or the like, right? Well, the product owner teams responsible for the capabilities there on the floor don't get to make that decision. But that's an executive decision related to vision and strategy, and setting that clarity up and giving the organization access to it is the beginning of delegation. But then, like Dennis said, making it possible for that understanding to be elaborated all the way through the system of delivery, but also the learnings to be accumulated and leveraged to adapt better ways to go and realize that vision and strategy. Like, that's the essence of the trustworthy system, right? It can execute on strategy, it can learn and adapt and find its best way to achieve the thing that the organization wants to achieve.
Chris, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that's, so directionally, Brian, I think that's dead on. I think, human nature, if there's two people, it's hard to get two people to agree. I mean, if you look at the 4 people on this panel.
We always agree. We argue a lot. It's fun. Yeah. So
when you talk about an organization of thousands that has potentially thousands of things it can go do, when you have, it's kind of an interesting moment early in that Ford transformation where Pivotal had come in and had introduced this PDO thing, ostensibly that Ford should be like Pivotal. Pivotal had a very, very focused product and set of products, right? It had it was very much like a triangle, and the whole organization could harmonize around that, I think pretty readily, and then they could delegate down. When you're most other organizations, like there are 1,000 things you could go do. There's multiple products and opportunities you have. And while threat it's a natural harmonizer. So under threat, when we have a global pandemic and we need to make face masks or whatever, ventilators, everybody can rally around that and it pretty naturally harmonizes you. But when you're in an opportunity space, all the things you could go do, opportunity is not a harmonizer. What you think the best opportunity is not what I think the best opportunity is. And so if we have 1,000 people trying to figure out what the opportunities are, and we don't have a way to harmonize that, then organizations can just become, kind of this spinning compass thing that we talked about, that Brian talked about this talk.
Yeah. So one of the questions that I think about a lot, and probably have been for about 15 years, is like everything that we do in the scaled agile space or the transformation space all derives from first principles. Like it's teams at the execution levels, it's backlogs, it's working tested product or working tested software, and in either the breaking or the managing of dependencies. So I think I've got 2 questions in this, but I'm going to ask the first one, and I'll start with Brian. Brian, so what role are dependencies playing organizationally and driving some of this complexity that we're trying to untangle?
Really, really big.
It's kind of a softball question, but so talk to me a little bit about the impact and how dependencies drive up the orchestration costs and such.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? We're working with one client right now that, I mean, super smart people, and I mean it seriously. They're great to work with, but they kind of bought the whole Kool-Aid of if I can just go and create a bunch of teams and trust that they'll do good things, and then I can just give some vision and strategy and magic things are going to happen. And what really happened is, for this company, it's a telco. I need to be a little careful here. For this company to deliver value to market in keeping with their vision and strategy, we've got 50 different things that have to be interconnected across their architecture. That's their reality today. We cannot want that to be the reality, but it is right now. So what happened is, of course, like imagine each of you has one piece of the solution that's going to have to go to market, and then you're asked in this room to go put those things together and bring them to market. And do it over there in that corner. Now you rush over there to the corner, and a couple of you are putting it together, but then it doesn't fit, and you discover that Melissa has the other piece, and then you get that in there, and then you say, well, wait, that didn't fit. James has got the other piece. Now, and you're just constantly working in backflow rather than forward flow to market. You're constantly dealing with exceptions instead of really strong decisions about what your customers need, what the most viable solutions are for those customers, and what's the best way to design it. So by understanding the sets of capabilities and how they need to fit together and how to organize teams around them, then we can put responsibility into teams and let them make as many of the decisions as possible responsibly, and then above them, just make sure that we're coordinating the right work, orchestrating the right work across them. So that's the process that we're going through right now with this one client, and the light bulbs have all come on. They're like, oh, I see exactly what happened.
Then they shut off, then they come back on.
That's true.
What's interesting is it's actually, in Brian's example, it's even more complicated because you're responsible for commercial, he's responsible for home consumer, and I'm responsible for innovative new products. But the capabilities are all the same. I don't have my own set of capabilities. You don't have your own set of capabilities. So we're all shoving stuff in at the same time too. And we're not rationalizing our demand against that capacity that's coming in. So it's just a nightmare, right? And then they're expecting, because they bought the Kool-Aid, those teams just figure it out.
Self-organize the dependencies away.
Yep.
Chris, anything to add?
Yeah, so aside from the obvious, which is the more that teams have to collaborate, I mean, you ultimately want to encapsulate your problem solving into the tightest, fewest sets of brains you can, right? But as we start to look at the dependencies in organizations, and that's just not possible that one person can own it, or one team can own it, or even one portfolio can own it. All of that human, you call it manual toilet handle jiggling or whatever you want to call it, has to happen to get something from start to done. Immense amounts of human capital involved in that. But the other thing we've kind of been running into some of our customers lately is they see these big sustained costs. Like there's this big giant number, and it just keeps going up. Every time we add features, that number goes up. And it's like, why is that happening? They don't, so the complexities of what they're trying to do in market now are amplifying the effect of those dependencies. And they don't just have, one of every product, they've got 6. kind of what Dennis was saying. So if you look at a business capability model, they have 6 of those capabilities, 5 of those they're replicated capabilities. So every time the business wants to do something, they don't go do it once, they have to do it 6 times. And so it's important to understand, those dependencies, not just within specific monolithic constructs, but even across, your business architecture.
So building on that a little bit, you and I were having a conversation earlier. We're building a capability within Leading Agile that a lot of times we just call product extraction. Talk a little bit about the idea of product extraction, product rationalization as it leads towards solving this problem you're talking about.
Yeah, so, having come from the XP world, right, hands-on XP developer, long-time committed test driver, I never really thought about the problem of software until I came to Leading Agile from a product and product team perspective. It was about the software itself. So how do I make the software softer? How do I do legacy rescue? How do I move this into a CI thing? Really what we've looked at now is sort of this notion of hard, crunchy shells and soft GUI centers. So first problem we have isn't to try to rescue the software. I mean, a prior corporate role, I had to eliminate a lot of architecture. I had replicated architectures and had to eliminate, a bunch of them. It took a long time to do that. But if we just make the problem of soft software a single team problem, so the ability to put a hard, crunchy shell to extract a product from its monolithic, whatever it's living in, its application. Applications are generally going to be monolithic containers of products, right? And so, to be able to pull that out around a product and product team boundary, here's the code, here's the build, the whole release pipe, the delivery pipeline, here's code organization, here's the behavior. Extract that out. That team can own that soup to nuts. And have it be be able to release on its own. Now that team can focus on the soft GUI center. How do I restore code health? How do I potentially even rewrite it if that's the right thing to do? But it's really breaking down monoliths into smaller monoliths, as opposed to maybe coming at it the way I would have 10, 15 years ago, which is to go figure out how to Boy Scout the code or do large scale refactorings that weren't informed by the notion of a product or product team. So that's really what product extraction is about, is how do we fit the pieces, and we'll find replicated pieces. There's capabilities that are probably some other product team already has that. We've replicated it. And during the process of extraction, we can actually start to rationalize that, right, and figure out how to.
I want to build on the question with you guys, slightly different angle. Dennis, when you and I met almost 15 years ago now, we were talking about business architecture. You work with Microsoft business architecture practice. And you had a really cool way of talking about the relationship between business architecture, product extraction, product rationalization. Talk to me a little bit about the intersection between those two things from your point of view.
So there's a couple things that are in my mind around it, but the concept of, taking the capability, identifying which ones have to move fast, which ones are performing poorly, where there's risk in it not being able to respond to the market, like getting really clear on that. And then looking at the layers of how it's implemented, being able to deliver it for the least expensive cost. And I think, we've talked a lot about like a QA type practice or a testing thing. There's challenge, but being able to wrap that capability with tests, the same types of tests that we're talking about here, to allow us to make that safer to move. One of the challenges I see with product extraction today is 80% of the code that we're helping our clients work on isn't actually owned by a team at the client. It's vendor code, or they want to be able to crash capacity against it, or they want to be able to outsource a part of it. Well, if we own the boundaries of the capability and the ability to validate that and make it be really clear to everybody, I can do things with scaling, resourcing, bringing people in. I can do things with an extracted product that I can't do today without making things worse. So creating these boundaries around those things, Chris uses the word turbulent. The pieces of the code that are going to be turbulent, we have to make them suitable and resilient to turbulence. And then we can handle all kinds of increase in capacity, moving around, vendor type work, but also we can then start to reduce the number of instances of the implementation, like Chris was talking about. We can start closing the performance gaps more explicitly. We can start really understanding what the costs are and what the challenges are, because the problem is not, it's like every time we change, it becomes more expensive. Or a problem we ran into with one of our clients is because things are not easy to change, the client's out buying other versions of it to solve their local problem, and then putting them all there, like hiring third parties to come and update their Salesforce implementation. And then it all ends up in the data center. They've got 900 versions of tailored Salesforce, and then it takes them 6 months to do a version upgrade.
Yeah.
So they're having to maintain a huge staff.
Brian, when you and I met, you were part of a group that had ownership of a large COBOL mainframe transaction processing engine, financial services. And I remember you taught me a lot about the idea of pulling services, moving to the cloud. Talk to me a little bit about how that experience, is that still kind of your belief? Does that tie into the conversations we've been having around business architecture and product abstraction?
Yeah, it does for sure. What you and I were working on in those days was surround and shrink. Pull capabilities out into a more modern architecture, put them in a platform that could evolve more quickly, and let this thing kind of reduce to its core. What's on my mind, though, as you asked that question, and I was listening to Chris talk through it, is like another scenario a little bit later than that. Over time, I'm trying to make sure I don't have to unpack this example too far to have it make sense. Over time, I spent 30 years in financial services, moving money one way or another. Over time, that space has become just increasingly complex. The forms that money takes, where it comes from, where it goes to, how it can get there. Is it ACH? Is it wire? Is it card? Is it cash but represented by a token? Is it real time? Is it 3-day? Is it infinite time? Like, it's just become incredibly complex. And what happened over time is all of those individual payment platforms were each solving a really broad array of capabilities. For example, for every time you're going to move a payment, then you've got to diagnose what's the source route and what's the destination route, and you've got to figure out how to connect them. You've got to do that every payment, whether it's card or wire or ACH or whatever, right? You got to do that every time. So over time, as the landscape became more complex, the routes, the availability of routes were more complex, and the regulatory requirements on what you had to do with that money while it was moving along those routes,
Right.
like, for example, money laundering checks or something like this, became so complex that we're constantly having to go to each one of those specialty systems and introduce all of this complexity. So just tying it back to Chris's story in that extraction, went to each one of those systems and drew a line around what's the part of it that's responsible for routing and regulatory decisions. So did that to card, did that to wire, did that to ACH, did that to bill payment, and pulled it all over here and said, now this capability, we drew a hard line around it, carved it out, put it together into something that could get reused kind of as a platform, and built team around that so that it could move at the speed that the market now needed it to move. Right? So I think that's an example of the sort of thing we're talking about.
So, Dennis, talk to me a little bit. There was I started off with your quote, what we talked about last week, right? And so do you want to try to say it instead of me trying to see if I can?
The only viable strategy today is to become a company that can execute rapidly evolving strategies.
Yeah, so talk to me a little bit about the nature of this organizational and technological refactoring we've been exploring and how that helps achieve that organizational goal.
Something I think is important to wrap around that conversation is the edges where you're going to have to compete by being super fast is 10 to 15 to 20% of most organizations. It's not 100% of it. So really understanding what you don't have to change rapidly is an important part of this. I got limited money, I got limited time, got to move fast. I can't spend a ton of time solving that problem. What I got to be able to do is identify those things that do have to move fast, where I'm going to have to compete. And then you start, like if the organization and the technology aren't aligned around those capabilities, and I don't have clarity on how I'm going to either change that capability, or in the case of like over the air, understand why that capability being emergent is so important. I have to be able to invest in it, put the right types of structures around it, and then make the technology able to support the rate I have to move while protecting all of the other concerns of the organization. So that view, I think that capability view is incredibly important. And we have to get really, really good at understanding what we don't have to be super, have high levels of agility in, and where we do need it, And then we have to focus on creating that agility across the board, organization, technology, and our ability to understand and respond to our customer. Those things have to align.
Yeah. Chris, I'm going to ask you a question, same question, but from a slightly different angle. So how does creating encapsulated teams, extracted products, hard country shells, soft GUI centers, you like to say, still haven't embraced that language yet, so I cringe every time I say it a little bit, but I get the point, right? So hard country shells, soft GUI centers, how does that help us be more dynamic as an organization? How does it help us redeploy our capabilities when markets and customers change?
Yeah, so if the products you have, in kind of that base camp 3, summit 3 kind of notion, right? Just think about what you would do if you didn't have that kind of dependency in your life, right? In your organization, how would you organize your products? What products would you have if you were unconstrained? Then you have to figure out how close you can get to that. And the ability also then, if you have, the process, right, of extracting a product is to create it with basically some sort of stable contract and stable contract tests, and then to cut off internal access, from consumers so that they're consuming that product through stable contracts. That allows you now so if each team can build, test, and release independently, you can still group them together in some way that makes the orchestration of whatever work they're doing. You can organize that, optimize it for a commercial channel or whatever, because you're going to push down orchestration into the system. I don't have 5 portfolios, I just have 1. And so you have the option now, where it's more difficult. We have customers who do this and actually take this on deliberately. They start to reorganize their products and their product teams before they break their dependencies.
Right, problematic.
And so all of a sudden something, maybe there were 6 teams that had to do something together to build and release an application. And somehow those 6 teams get federated out into some more optimal business aligned, value aligned structure. Okay, but now the builds have to be coordinated across portfolios. So those dependencies have to orchestrate very high and very wide in the organization, right? So as we get stable contracts in place, hard crunchy shells, as we get software that the turbulent areas of that software is very, so low flat cost to change curve for that software. Now we can start to group things differently. We don't have to worry about the groupings because of some technical dependency. We can group them by value. And we can start to release, do what's called coding dark release until we want to turn it on. There's all kinds of things that enables, and we can continue to change that as our value propositions move in market.
Yeah.
And the ability to compose or and consume things in ways they weren't originally intended when you do this really well is a critical part of being able to move fast. I've got a stable unit. Now I can go use my fraud thing for bank deposits as well as ATM deposits, which we never even thought would be putting cash into ATMs, but all of a sudden we were. And we're able to use a composable piece of work that we had never considered before without having to rewrite it all. We just plugged it right into the ATM guys. So that composability thing is an important aspect.
So Brian, same question. So how does encapsulation, both at the product level, technology level, organizational level, support this ability to dynamically redeploy resources and be the kind of organization that can change to strategies?
Yeah, I was thinking about actually the same kind of example that Dennis just went to.
He stole your financial services.
Yeah, it's good. Well,
okay.
I actually did it.
That's right.
It's so adorable.
We've done so many
fight.
of them together, it's true. But when you, so let's go from that specific example and just sort of zoom back some and think about if you can get an understanding of what are the core capabilities that you really have to have. And Dennis and Chris both talked about how the reality for most of us today is we have multiple copies of implementations of those capabilities. So if we can get, number one, really clear on what capabilities we need to have, and then number two, get the implementations of those capabilities into the right spot so that they can move the way that they need to move as this capability needs to move, then that map gives us the ability to say, hey, here's this evolving need. What do I have that I can put together to meet that need? I need that and that and that. Oh, and I only just have to go, build this one thing new and change this one thing, and now I'm quickly responding to this evolving need in the market.
Okay, awesome. Anything else you guys want to add before I pivot and take us a slightly different direction?
No, I think, yes.
Yes.
As a matter of fact.
Yes.
No, yes. But I think what's interesting, and we get focused on it as a technology problem. It absolutely is. The organizational alignment problem, it absolutely is. We do have to have resilience in our organizational patterns underneath it, which is actually a technology problem. But if we're not paying attention to deeply understanding the customer and the opportunities and the options that we need to create with the customers, like that lens of deeply understanding the market is a critical part of making the right choices here, because you can only do so many of these at a time.
Yeah.
Right? You got to get the right ones or you're going to be kind of in trouble.
Yeah, that's where I was going to build a little bit in that, the whole one size doesn't fit all message. Some things just need to be predictable. Some things, there are maintenance streams. There's not a lot of gap in the capability, but it does need to be predictable. I mean, there's a place for commercial software, and there's a big place for it for things that are non-differentiating. But when you find that certain pieces of that are holding you back, there could be actually a bottleneck to value creation. You have to isolate the products so that you want. And so, like, I was talking to a customer a couple months ago who was multi-divisional, large organization, and they're letting each division lead determine their product model. So every division is defining its products differently.
Yeah.
And so when you try to actually bring all that together in some enterprise way, some of them are more like what their tools are. Some of them are actually based on business capabilities. Some of them are based on applications, and there's really no rhyme or reason to it. They're different. There's no conversion. There's not like a currency thing, right? They're just different. And so you can't tell what the replicated products are. You can't, even though they have value propositions that cross-cut all of that, it's really hard to make sense of it. So as Dennis is talking about, emphasizing the need to understand customer, value propositions, markets, problems, things like that, can't overstate the importance of having a good business architecture underneath you, understanding your capabilities, knowing what you're wrapping your products around, knowing that those products reflect you as a business, not you as a set of org chart nodes, and not having a bunch of a lot of needless variation on, what the core meaning or capability of these things are. So it's important to have that business architecture underneath the enterprise.
Any final things? Okay. Let's see if I can pivot us a little bit. I'm not sure 100% where I'm going with this, so we'll see if we can have some fun with it. So one of the things I was talking, I think it was our latest group of consultants came in and we were doing some onboarding with them. And one of the things that I talked about with them was the idea that everything that we do flows from first principles, right? And a lot of times it starts with, you have to have teams. They have to be a certain way. They have to be, there have to be backlogs. There has to be the ability to produce a working tested product. In the presence of dependencies, you have to break dependencies or you have to manage dependencies, which a lot of times, is why we do orchestration, why we do governance, right? How we tie all the way up to strategy. So I guess the question is what are the first principles that you believe we're applying as we kind of move into this space and talk about organizational redesign? Yeah.
So I've been thinking a lot about that. I think there are some economic first principles. Everything we do costs money.
Yeah.
And if we can't connect it to the benefit we're going to give, like I have to determine what teams I'm going to form based on which ones give me the best economic return. I have to determine which dependencies we're going to break based on which ones release the most value for the most important customers. We have to understand how we're going to measure and reward people for success. We have to do it in a way that it motivates the most important behavior. So I think this anchoring in economic concerns is a critical first principle. I also, Mike, you and I go way back on, and all of us on the theory of constraints. There's always a next constraint, but the constraint might be different based on where you're trying to go. So really deeply understanding the actual constraint and what it constrains you from doing, I think that's a first principle thing, being able to see the obstacle and then come up with the right way to fix it so you get the economic return. I think that sort of theory of constraints, economic prioritization, always moving towards being able to execute more effectively on your current or emerging strategies or first principles.
Brian, anything you want to add to that?
I'll add a separate one right alongside that. And I think I've been talking for too long now. You can tell my voice, I'm losing it. But I think it's attached to what Chris was saying in that enterprise architecture. You know, we want to reduce the dependency across the organization, of course, and enable people to move. But sometimes the way that we reduce those dependencies is to come together with a better understanding of the enterprise architecture. And that's both for that capability map, but also for the organization and its capabilities behind those business capabilities. And being intentional and creating a cohesive enterprise architecture, I think, is one of the foundational principles in what we're trying to do.
Yeah, it's really important.
Anything, Dad?
Where my head went on that when you asked that question, it was kind of an interesting. I didn't expect my brain to go there, but it went there. So we've talked about, and I've expressed in the past, right? There's a difference between discovery and invention, and so what we're doing, yes, there is some invention to it in terms of how we go lead change and things like that. What we're learning, though, is a lot of discovery, I think. I think there are laws of physics at play. Certain things have to be true for other things to be true. And so and it goes back to my experience even prior to leading Agile, as I was feeling and coming through some of this work. I hadn't codified it. I hadn't thought through it in anywhere close to the level that you and Dennis had, but I had learned to come through transformation in a certain sequence, and it's because I had to. That was the way I had to do it. And so I think what we're doing is we're discovering some things, and then we're, inventing some things to basically exploit that discovery. But it does comes down to, actually, at the end of the day, we believe that this work that we do and the work that a lot of organizations do is best done with teams. And so that team's backlogs, working tested product thing, to me is foundational. And then building on that, though, I think sometimes as Agilists, we're maybe a little too principled. And, so you and I are both principle-styled people, and sometimes we'll cut off our nose to spite our face, right? That's the joke that Mike and I have running. But there's real pragmatic realities out there. And so, like, the reality of safety for people, the reality of, for the longest time, I've had people rail on the whole notion of having to do capitalization the way they do it, or, like accounting stuff. All you have to do is go change global tax law. I mean, that's pragmatically, like, just go change
kind of tough, little challenge.
Global tax law.
Yeah.
Right? And so there are things that people have to deal with that don't fit the principled space. Principally, it doesn't make sense. Pragmatically, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen someday, but we just can't necessarily attach it to what we're going to do right now in the situation we're in. We're going to have to make some pragmatic judgment on how best to take care of a concern that we know maybe, isn't something primary, to the performance of the organization, but is important to somebody somewhere.
So I kind of asked that question to tee up this one. And so I had a couple of ideas in my slide deck around the next 20 years, right? And one of the things we talk about, we pull Gartner research, we listen to what our clients are telling us about. And we went through this moment where we were like, should we be talking about digital transformation? Should we be talking about DevOps or CI/CD or P2P or PDO, like whatever the words are of the day, right? And in my head, as I'm looking at all these different things, I'm like, what is fundamentally different? And so I'd love each of you to pick a topic, something that's on the forefront, something we're reading about, something we're hearing about that sounds different, but is fundamentally the same first principles.
So I think this is pretty cool.
See, I can ask these guys any hard question, and I'll lead with Dennis on the hard ones because I know he's super quick with this kind of stuff. So
What I think
excited to see what he says.
What I think is pretty cool is one of the things that works with what we're doing around forming teams is so humans are humans. Like human nature fundamentally isn't going to change. Tribal leadership, teams forming together and pitting them against a problem and having them solve it. I think everything that we're doing, and one of the reasons we have a lot of success is everything we do, we're forming teams around. We're forming teams around the transformation challenges. We're forming teams around the software challenges. We're forming teams around the prioritization and customer understanding problem. By forming those teams and giving them a problem, they're able to solve for it. So I think that regardless of what the challenges are that come up, and I think they are going to change, I think our transformation principles, like I know Chris was making fun of me earlier today because when I talk about the organizational stuff, all I talk about is getting to the organization. Like I don't talk about the people side of it. And Anita gave us a beautiful, eloquent convening, teaming, learning, growing. Like the blue side of that was super powerful, right? And we don't sit around talking about how people feel about their jobs very often when we're talking about designing organizations. But I think that it works because when we form these teams and we give them a target and we create safety around them to go accomplish that goal, they accomplish great things, right?
Yeah.
So that fundamental first principle. So the teaming stuff is important because of the human aspect of it. It doesn't matter what problem we're going after. That is going to be true regardless of where we're going the next 20 years.
Yeah. Chris, give me a specific one. So like something that you're knee deep in with Ford, like a projects to products kind of a thing. Like it sounds different, right? It sounds like a new thing, but is it a new thing?
It's an interesting journey, right? I was Googling some stuff on the flight down this morning. Sorry, there's my mic here. There was a Forrester article that was talking about, in effect, value streamlining an organization, right? So SAFe has these notions or whatever, but not necessarily honoring the truth that had to happen, right, to make that successful. So treating it like its own thing,
Right.
And what's interesting when you look at OKRs without some of the prerequisite things, they tend to fall flat, right? If you don't have empowered, like we talked about, don't have empowered product owners,
Reliable system delivery.
So what's interesting is as we're being, asked by companies to help them with this journey, and as we're helping them along, we're hitting the same things. And then we see these themes come out in the, in the kind of consulting ether around, projects to products. Okay, so that's, basically trustworthy system with product thinking, product centricity. And so then we go to like this whole, this notion
of product centricity, you have to have product extraction, you have to have organized around business architecture.
So I expect, because I think we're discovering some things, not necessarily inventing some things, I think you'll see that track in industry as well. So this whole notion of breaking up your, of extracting your dependencies, and I was starting to see some of that come out in what I was reading this morning, right? So some, people are coming to these epiphanies as they go through this process. I think the difference though is they're treating them like, because it's a thing that they can go sell unto itself or go do unto itself. They're not taking care of the prerequisites. And that's why these things tend to struggle and fail when you just go do the latest thing versus all the work that you need to do to make the latest thing work.
Okay. Brian, anything you want to add? You want to pick an area that's same first principles?
So here's where my head's going, and this is going to be messy. So
you've been warned.
Yeah. Here's the thing. It's fascinating, right? What we're really doing is building complex adaptive systems. We're acknowledging that, which isn't new. Like the idea of complex adaptive systems is not new, but we're acknowledging that that's what organizations today must be. They already are. We have to acknowledge that that's what they must be. And within that, we're thinking about what's the intentionality of architecture. And we're thinking about how do we use empirical controls to maintain movement in the direction that we want in accordance with the strategic articulation, to know that we're delivering the results that we're delivering, measuring the entropy that is going to naturally come into existence within that complex adaptive system, and making choices empirically about what we're going to do about it. So it's so not so much one specific example, but some fundamentals of science of building complex adaptive systems that we're deploying in creative and integrated ways that allow us to take an organization where it needs to go.
With humans who are going to behave the way that humans behave today. Like this idea that we can make humans be different in how they interact with each other, and the whole world's going to be different when that happens, it's just not going to happen. And we have to be able to design these within how people actually interact.
Regardless of how hopeful we might be, at least in the short run, pragmatically, it might be difficult.
Next 1,000 years or so.
Yes, okay, yeah. Okay, so this is totally orthogonal to anything we talked about. But it's an interest and a passion of mine that I was going to talk about. But since I've decided to have you guys do my closing keynote for me, then you guys get to answer the question. So I think a lot about academia, science, universities, things like that, as it comes to what we do. Right? The theories of organizational change, the theories of organizational design, and things like that. And was heavily influenced over the last couple of years. I've gotten involved in the industrial and systems engineering department at my alma mater. We actually, a lot of our younger consultants are industrial systems engineering majors. And I tend to think that the kind of change that we're talking about is really the application of industrial and systems engineering to the software factory. Right? I know we were talking about that word's a little bit loaded today, but I think about just the process, right, of building software. So I'd love your guys' thoughts. Assuming my hypothesis is right, and this is kind of the academic base, like what would you look for new grads, or if you were developing a program, what kinds of academic areas of study do you think prepare somebody to understand this kind of work that we do?
That's interesting. What background does a great business architect have?
Yeah.
He understands the flow of work. He understands the organization of people. She.
Yeah.
She understands the ability that these are business decisions and what it means to understand the customer. Like that connecting, because I think this intersection of the product and the architect, we talked about it earlier, how that's so critical, the product perspective and the architecture perspective. And it's not just architecting the technology, it's architecting the organization. So people that are learning to think in systems, but also I think they need some economic and financial background, because they're all business decisions. And I think we lose a lot of that a lot of times. It's amazing to me how often in the Agile community, the conversations have nothing to do with actually like pragmatic economic or market decisions.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm looking for some finance, I'm looking for some business, and I'm looking for some systems thinking architecture. I think the industrial engineering probably doesn't have enough of the human aspect or the financial aspect built into it. So I don't want to build that in.
Yep. Brian, Chris?
So the human thing was kind of where I was going to go.
I was thinking org design, org psych. That's actually a lot of your background, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, org design, organizational psychology, the interplay of decision making actually goes back to what I was talking about a little while ago. Complexity factors. I think it would be easy for folks to see in an ISE program, see the world as, well, if I could just set it up so that there's decision A, B, C through F, then good things will happen. That's just not reality for the sorts of things that we're trying to do in the world today. So appreciating the nature of the human interactions and the nature of the complexity that's in play in the organization and the dynamics that brings and what to do with that, I think is critical.
Anything there, Chris?
Yeah, I think it's a family of people really that cover the full orb set of skills that you're looking for. But one of the things that I was remarking, what I was tweaking Dennis on, right, is because we're all very systems oriented people and very much about building systems that perform. That's how we tend to think about people sometimes, right? But the focus on the customer is an interesting, so building on kind of what Dennis said, customer obsession, right, is what some companies call it. And so we talk a lot about systems and software factory. The factory, you know, I know where that notion is and I know where it's been, but sometimes it actually causes us to think about order taking, right? So tell us what to build, we'll go build it and spit it out the other side.
It's a repeatable part coming down an assembly line when it's more creative.
And so really what organizations are having to do is to obsess on their customer and figure out, you know, each product is an evergreen piece of that experience that they agree to obsess over. And so, so I would be looking to really have someone who, you know, there are programs like this out there who are really good at understanding, you know, not just desirability, not, you know, but also, you know, the viability piece of product, like getting that. Menlo Innovation calls them high-tech anthropologists.
Yeah, I like that.
You know, and so their job is not to just go figure out what an ergonomic, usable piece of software or product is. It's, should we build a thing in the first place, and what does it need to do? And so that kind of, you know, design thinking, product centricity, customer centricity thing. I think that's just going to be critical for organizations moving forward. They can't order take or just implement someone's bright idea anymore.
Okay, awesome. Thank you guys so much for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Awesome. Appreciate you being here. And we'll see you next year.